So kids always want to know the first thing, what the heck is on the final, right? So what we've got for the final exam, couple of notes for you guys. There are about 60 multiple choice questions. Some of them you may have seen, some of them you may not have seen. They pull from a test bank, and they will pull randomly but fairly from the units that we have already studied. You will have 3 written questions as part of that. They are going to be written questions sort of like we've done before, where you have multiple steps. You've done a lot of those FRQ type questions. Is how they tend to be labeled in the class, where you say, okay, this is a situation, what should the government do, how does the loanable funds market react, what are the Fed's 3 choices? That would be like one of your questions, right? So you're going to have 3 of those questions where you've got multiple parts to put together. The biggest thing that becomes an issue with economics tests is your graphs have to be submitted when you take the test. You need to submit them to the question on the test, and it needs to be submitted before you leave your testing room. So plan in advance to take care of that. If you are somebody who's had some issues with submitting graphs in the past, I would strongly suggest that you go ahead and submit them with your test and then email them to me at the same time. Do not copy and paste your pictures. That is something that tends to end up with broken links. Like if you just hit, picture, copy, picture, paste, that doesn't work. You need to actually lay the file into the question. So if you go into those submission boxes, you should be able to upload an actual picture image into your written sections and work with that like you have in the past. There's no difference in what you've done on a test. But if you've had issues in the past, I would strongly suggest that you also email your graphs to me and hold on to those until you've seen a final exam score pop up on your Schoology. And just remember, any late work you need to submit needs to get turned in ASAP, preferably before your final exam. Questions for me on exam structure as far as how that's going to go? Okay, so if you think of anything, please feel free to type answers into the box or type little questions in the box, and I'll get those as they pop up. It is never rude to type a question while I'm talking about something else. When I have a second to pause, I will answer whatever question you've stuck in there today, because the goal is to review the whole summer. We don't have time to break down literally every little bit, but we do have time to stop and make sure that you understand the basics. Remember that as you're studying, you still have access to all of your quizzes, all of your tests. You can go back and look at old homework assignments. In your updates, you've got a lot of information that I've given you extra in the class. If you know that you're weak on a certain unit, you can go back to that unit in Schoology and look at the videos and look at the instruction that we've given you. You can always go back and look at your textbook. You've got a lot of sources there to help you as you're looking to study. So what I did for us is I put together just a quick little tutorial about the stuff that you're going to run into on your final. You test how to build graphs, draw I/O. Yes, you should be able to do that with no problem. And just let your proctor know so that they know that you're not, cheating or whatever. I would just walk in and say, part of this is I have to create a graph, and whether you make it in Draw.io or if you make it in Word or whatever you're used to building in, just let them know that that's what you're going to do, and you're going to save it and upload it. And most proctors are just kind of like, yeah, whatever, kid, just it's better to be upfront with them so that they don't freak out when they see you working on something that seems to be a non-standard testing situation, if that makes some sense. So graphs that we Yeah, absolutely. Graphs that we've been through this summer. If you remember all the way back to Unit 1, we worked with a PPF. A PPF is going to show you the production possibilities of a particular country. So let's scribble on here real quick for you. Remember that you're going to have 2 goods. It could be like coconuts and pineapples if we're on a deserted island. It could be something like guns and butter. This one simply just does consumer goods and capital goods, and that's fine. If you're talking about where I want to target myself, my goal is to be in point A. I want to be somewhere on the line of this PPF. It doesn't matter if I'm on point A, we'll call this point B, we'll call this point ABC, we'll call this point D. There's no problem as long as you're on the line on a PPF. Where you have issues on a PPF is if you are over or underperforming. In a PPF, if I'm at somewhere like point C down here, I am inside the PPF line. That means that I'm not producing as much as I could. So I've got something going on in my world, like I've got unemployment, I've got some sort of natural disaster, I have undertrained workers, I have some issue that's causing me not to be as productive as I ought to be. If I'm out here, we'll call this point E. If I'm outside my PPF out here, that means that I am overproducing. I am in a world where I'm working and working and working and working, but I'm getting sort of a sustainable amount of production happening. Great example for this, since it's finals week, this is my favorite one to use with my face-to-face kids. If you stay up studying for final exams, let's say you're going to take your exam tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock is your appointment, and you stay up studying until like 10 o'clock tonight, you feel pretty comfortable, and you go to bed, right? Let's say that means that you wake up in the morning and you're going to get like a B- on your final. Well, what if you study for 1 more hour, and that 1 more hour gets you to study like, you get a B, and you study for another hour, you're going to get B+, right? So as you study more and more and more, you're going to get a better grade, in theory. But let's talk about what those hours look like, right? By the time you get to like 1 o'clock in the morning, you're like negotiating with yourself. You're like, I'm such a good studier, I'm going to Insta-face tweet this. Or I'm such a good studier, I'd be better with a hot cocoa. Or I'm such a good studier, I need to tell my friends about it. And you start to be less productive as those hours go forward. But what also happens is you're losing sleep. So that productive resource of brain space and well-restedness is going away. So you show up tomorrow and maybe you get like this amazing grade on your final, but what's the rest of your day like? You're super tired. You sleep through math. You sleep through all of your classes. You can't really do great at, you know, a sports practice that you have in the afternoon, because you've used up all of your resources. That's what point E is like. It is possible for an economy to run too hot, to be too productive, and then you run out of stuff. You run out of basic materials, you run out of labor, you run out of things, and so then you would send your economy into a recession. Okay, so that's a PPF. You'll see that every once in a while pop up on your final, so just in case you remember that one. The big graph that we used almost all summer was the aggregate supply-demand graph. This is one that you need to be very familiar with. You need to be able to draw in your sleep and be very with it. If you need a tutorial on this, we did a whole live session on aggregate supply-demand earlier in the summer, and that is in your updates. So if you kind of scroll back, I want to say it was about a month ago, you can find the specific tutorial on this. A couple of pro tips that I always like to give to kids is that when you're looking at this graph, the most often thing that happens for kids is you forget an LRAS. That is your long run aggregate supply. So like when I'm drawing this guy, the first thing I do is I draw my axis and I give it a PL and a RGDP. Oh, I'm sorry, this is so messy. And then the first thing that I do is I draw myself an LRAS. Because that's what tells me where my economy is at, right? If without a long-run aggregate supply, I have no clue if I'm in a recession, if I'm in inflation. I have no clue what's happening in my economy if you only give me short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So when I make these, the first thing I do is an LRAS. That way I never forget it. And then I read the question and I go, okay, it wants me to show a recession. So then I draw my aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and then make sure that I've got all my labels, all my lines. Remember, you want every equilibrium point needs to have a label going to it. So you'd have like a PL Y1, you'd have like a Y1, and then a YF at full employment. Okay, so just don't forget the long run aggregate supply. Don't forget you need to have all 3 lines on there. I've seen this summer, for some reason, y'all, this is an interesting group of folks who you give me the long run aggregate supply, then maybe only aggregate demand, and you just don't give me the short run aggregate supply. That's also weird because I have no clue where equilibrium is. I have no clue where I want to be. I need to see all 3 lines on every single one of those graphs. So just kind of keep that in mind. As we're doing that, remember that you've got that equation for GDP that I was super obnoxious and made you guys learn over and over and over and over. So GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which let's have you guys tell me in the box. What are C, I, G, X, and M? Just type it in the box really quick. Everybody can pick a letter. Consumer spending C, very good. Governance G, good. I like it. X minus M is imports export. I invest, very good. Good job. Good job. Oh, Mary's got them all. Excellent. So those are the things that make up your GDP, right? That's the entire thing. Consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, imports and exports. You guys seem to be pretty good with government spending, pretty good with consumption. Problems that ask you questions about investment and exports and imports are where you seem to struggle. In this last unit, you had a question asking you about a change in imports exports, and a lot of you guys didn't get that one, or you like talked yourself around it, and I had to see a couple submissions from you guys. Remember that what I'm doing is following the money. Okay, so if I see in a question, perhaps that a government has put some changes into the auto industry, causing consumers to purchase more cars from other countries and not from their home country. If you look at the GDP equation, that is going to be an imports issue, right? That's going to be that where I'm buying something, say from, I'm going to get a Japanese car instead of an American car. Well, where did the money go? The money went to Japan, not to the United States, right? So for the United States, that's going to be a decrease in my GDP. It's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so remember that as you're doing these, GDP is aggregate demand. So if you see a question about consumer spending, government spending, investment spending, that's going to be an aggregate demand issue. Just going to keep that in mind. Questions for me on that piece? Okay, if you think of one, let me know. One of the things that kids often forget to do is read the question, whether it's a multiple choice question or a written question. You need to look at what state is the economy in. If the question tells you we are at long run equilibrium, that's great. If they tell you that we are at a recession or an inflation, or we are, above natural rate of employment or below natural rate of employment, you need to know where those economies are. So remember, if the question tells you to start with a gap, you need to make sure that your aggregate supply demand starts with that gap. You don't need to shift into that gap. I see a lot of kids who still have that tendency to say, say I'm starting with a recession. They would give me a graph that looks like this. Let me draw this a little bit better. They would say, let's call this 80. They would give me 81, and they would show me a shift into that recessionary gap. Please don't do that. Just start with the graph at a gap. or start with the graph at an inflationary gap. So just make sure you're starting where the question tells you to be, and then move from there. And again, remember, you need to make sure you label everything. Quick little hint, you've noticed that the questions are very specific and they say, draw me this graph and use these specific labels. If the only labels that it gives you is they say, tell me it's something like Y1 and PL1, if there's only labels that they ask for, you generally are at an equilibrium. If they ask you for 3 labels, so you'd say like let's call this Y1, YF, and P1, that is generally a hint that you are not at equilibrium. So if you've got a question that's giving you label suggestions, just kind of keep that in mind, that that can be a hint if you're really unsure of that you need to be on a gap if you've got 3 labels that they're asking for. Okay. Olivia and Claire, are you guys typing? Oh, no worries. Okay, so after aggregate supply demand, the next one that we look at is the Phillips curve. So for a Phillips curve, you need to have long run and short run to make a proper graph. So in this case, you've got, I'm showing rate of inflation and rate of unemployment, and I'm graphing those to show you where I'm at for the economy. The long run Phillips curve is set at the natural rate of unemployment, which is different for every economy. They may give you a number, or they may just call it X or Y or whatever. But that is where the economy tends to go back to a certain percentage of inflation. Like in the United States, we tend to be between 4 and 6%. Oftentimes we just call it 5 because we have to pick a number. But the goal is to always get back to that natural rate of unemployment. So if I've got a graph that looks like this, and we said that the economy is over here at like 8% inflation, and I'm down here at like 3% unemployment, we'll call this point B. I am not at my long run equilibrium, right? So I need to do something to get me from point B to point A, to get my economy back into shape. So when you're looking at this, you always want to make sure you've got a short run and a long run. You always want to make sure that you've labeled long run, short run, inflation, unemployment, label your equilibrium spots, label points A and B. If you give me a graph that literally just has like one dot out here without a label, I may not see that. I may not pick up on it. You're going to want to make sure that you drop a label in there so it's very clear that this is the point that you're talking about, and there's a difference between maybe the economy moved from A to B. There's nothing wrong with adding little arrows. You want to label everything to make sure it's very clear what you intend to talk about. Okay? So, quick quiz. Get ready to type in the box. Why is the LRPC vertical? Why is it a completely straight line? Because the general area returned to long run. Okay. I'll take that as part one of the answer. It's where I go back to, and why is that where I go back to? Because in the long run, dot, 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 Ooh, this is a homework question I sent back to a bunch of you guys. Perfect, Maddie. Good job. Because no matter what happens with inflation, the natural rate of unemployment is going to be the same. Because in the long run, inflation and unemployment are not related. They're only related to each other in the short run. Because over time, the whole point of a natural rate of unemployment is that I'm going to go back to that rate over time, even if I don't do anything else. Very good job. We'll take Callie and Maddie added together for the win. I like it. Okay. So, next graph we need to look at is loanable funds. Loanable funds is a supply and demand graph. It is a graph where I'm looking at loans made to people and loans made by those who have money. If you are looking for a bunch of detail about loanable funds and money market, which will be the next one, we did a live session on those. So you should be able to go and pull those up and take a look at them. So in this case, you've got a supply and demand for loanable funds. I always make my face-to-face kids add extra labels to this when they're first learning it, and it might help you to do that as you're studying. I always go demand by borrowers. I'm so sorry, this is messy writing with my mouse. So demand by borrowers, supply by savers or investors. Wow, that's really messy. Let's mess around with this. If I go by, how's that? Supply by savers and investors, and I've got demand by borrowers. I always just like to do that because that way you know exactly what is happening in each one of those markets. So who demands money in loanable funds? People do, businesses do, and the government does. If the government is running a deficit, they have to get that money from somewhere, and that has to come from the loanable funds market as we are going through things. Where does the supply of loanable funds come from? Supply is by people who save money. When you save money in the bank and your savings account is just sitting there, hope it's not news to you that's like your loanable funds is coming from what people have saved. Your account, when you deposit $100, is not just going to sit there in a box with your name on it and no one will touch it. They're going to hold back that required reserve ratio, but then the rest of it they're going to loan out to people in order to make money. So when people begin to save more, that is going to increase the supply of loanable funds. You also have investors who are buying like stocks and bonds, investors who are putting their money out there to be borrowed. Like if you say interest rates that are getting really, really high, you're going to see people who go, awesome, I will take that, and they are going to be more willing to loan you money because they're going to get more back in interest. So I just find that sometimes adding those extra little modifiers can help you as you're studying. Okay. With that, in the same unit came the money market. So in this case, you've got money demand and money supply. So money demand is people who demand money. That is you, me, anybody who wants cash on hand is going to be a demander of money. Now, with the money supply, who supplies money in the U.S.? Type it in the box for me real quick. Who supplies money? There you go. Yeah. Anybody who's typing or has typed the Fed, good job. You and I do not get to photocopy money, right? You and I do not get to make our own money. The only time money supply changes is if the Fed chooses to change how much money is out there. So the only time that money supply will shift is if the Fed has done something to change the amount of money in circulation, okay? So you've got a bunch of different ways that the Fed can change how much money is available. The most often one that they use is the buying and selling of bonds. So if I've got some choices, I can buy bonds and I can sell bonds, right? Now, which one of these, buying bonds or selling bonds, is going to be the one where I end up with more money in the economy, buying or selling? A lot of votes for selling. So, okay. Uh-oh. We're starting to have a split here. So let's walk through buy bonds, sell bonds, because I think this is something to make sure that you really understand, because some of you guys are still not on the right page with this. So a bond is like a piece of paper, right? It's a piece of paper that says, we, the United States government, promise that this paper will be worth something in the future. Love the federal government, right? So if I'm the bank and I am selling money to Bank of Mecum, because that's what I'm looking at right now, and I go, hey, Corbin, would you like to buy some bonds? And he's like, well, yeah, that sounds like a really good investment. It's going to help my portfolio as a bank. I'm going to get interest money back. I'm going to hand Corbin a bunch of pieces of paper. And in return, he's going to hand me a bunch of cash to buy that from. So the bank itself ends up with paper. The Federal Reserve then takes away all the money. So if the Fed is selling bonds, you end up with a smaller money supply. Okay? And it's simply because when I sell bonds, you get paper, the Fed gets the money. When I buy bonds, I go to Bank of Corbin and I say, hey, I'd like to buy some of those bonds off of you. And Corbin's like, well, that sounds great. Here are some bonds. He's going to give me, the Federal Reserve, a bunch of pieces of paper, right? And then in return, the Fed has to give him a whole bunch of cash, right? So if I buy bonds, it's going to be a bigger money supply. Okay, so buy bigger, sell smaller is the way I always tell my kids to remember that when we're talking face-to-face. Okay, and the money supply shifts just like regular money supply does. If I've sold a bunch of bonds and so now I have a smaller money supply, I'll see my money supply shift to left, right? You'd want to have a MS2. You'd want to make that say MS1. You want to say like that's Q2. This would be your interest rate 2. And you'd show that it would go up. Okay, so this is one of those graphs to make sure that if the Fed is changing stuff, you're changing money supply. If it's changing how people interact with money, or people who are using money more or less, or businesses who are using money more or less, that's going to be the use thing is going to be a demand. But remember that people and businesses cannot change how much money is supplied in the market. That's only the Federal Reserve. Okay. I know a situation is a supply demand. Like, is there a question to ask yourself? Yeah. So if I have a situation where we're trying to find out what's happened, if you see something like the Federal Reserve buys bonds on the open market, seeing the Fed as part of what's going on should clue you in that it's going to be a money supply issue. If you see something like businesses are generally going out to invest more in growing their businesses, well, to do that they have to demand money, right? They have to go out there and they have to say, I need access to cash so that I can build my building and fill it with machines and pour concrete and pay workers. They have a bigger demand for money at that point if they're acting inside the economy. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then our last question, or I'm sorry, our last big graph that we have is looking at the Forex market, the foreign exchange market. So on all these graphs, let's see, let's do a blank one real quick because I didn't draw this out very well for you guys. So on these graphs, you're going to start off with a set of axes, right? And I always make you guys draw these in pairs because I'm super mean like that. And each one is going to be a basic supply and demand. Now, I always do these side by side because you got to compare two currencies at once. And you're only ever comparing two currencies. So let's say we're comparing the euro and the dollar. So we're going to have one that is the quantity of US dollars, and we have one that is the quantity of euro. Now, how do I know where the fraction goes? Because the price is a fraction, right? The currency is on the bottom of your quantity. So this is the quantity of US dollars, so it's a US dollar graph, goes on the bottom of your equation. Okay, so then I would have, on this one, I would have euros over US dollars. And then on this guy, I would have US dollars over euros. Okay, so that way you've got a match between, oh, I pushed erase! Fail. Okay. So I've got, I want to have a match between what's on the bottom of the graph and what's on the sides of the graph. Okay. Now, once I have that, I have to figure out how this is all going to go through my economy. I can't just take my dollars and turn them into euros and make it be whatever it is that I want. I have to make it something that the banks are willing to do, right? So I can't walk in the bank and say, give me euros, without handing them something else. This should be back to setup, euros. Okay. So if this is my current situation and I want to change US dollars to euros, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the bank and I'm going to say, hey, bank, how you doing? I am going to offer you something to get my euros, right? So I have to offer you dollars in exchange for my euros. So what that does is it says, I'm going to increase my supply of US dollars, right? And in exchange, I'm going to increase my demand for euros. Okay, so I go D1, D2, we'll go S1, S2. Now, what I want you to see is that on each graph, your original equilibrium point is going to begin as the same one. Okay, but in a foreign exchange market, you're going to have a winner and a loser. Okay, so in this case, when I don't want US dollars anymore, do you see how my exchange rate depreciates, goes down in value? And when I do want more euros, my exchange rate is going to appreciate. It is going to increase over here on the side. You always want to make sure that one appreciates, one depreciates, because if you don't do it that way, something is wrong. Okay? And that's why I make you draw them side by side, so you make sure you understand I have to supply one to demand the other. It is sort of okay to mess around with demand, as in increasing or decreasing demand for a dollar. But what actually really happens in the market is that I'm supplying those dollars, right? The dollars become relatively more available because I've handed dollars to the bank and I've taken euros out of circulation to put them into my pocket. So the most proper way to talk about it is increasing supply of one so that you can increase the demand for the other. Okay? Does that make sense that far? How does the value of currency invested is made foreignly? So if I'm in a situation like that, I would have like, let's say I would have my supply and my demand, right, for the currency you're focused on. But remember, you've also got the currency that you're changing to and from, right? So let's stick with, we'll call this US dollars, and we'll call this one euros. Okay, so if I am looking to invest in a euro type of situation, like I want to go buy German government bonds, or I want to invest in the euro as a currency or something like that, I have to do a couple of things. I have to, first of all, change my money and put it where I want it to go, right? So I want to supply my extra money to the US dollar market because I'm getting rid of US dollars. And then I would be increasing my demand for euros, right? Because I need to change from dollars to euros to end up with the money that I want to invest in. Then, now that I own those euros, then I want to go into the loanable funds market, right? So I would have my supply and demand for loanable funds. This price of loanable funds. We'll have this quantity of loanable funds. I'm so sorry, this is messy. But then when I go into this market, when I go as an investor, I am out there going, I want to own your stuff, right? So I want to make sure that I can go out and borrow and loan and be participating in that market. So because I'm adding my money into that mix, you're going to see a increase in the loanable funds market, right, to like S2, because now I've taken my money that used to be dollars and I've turned it into like a stock or a bond or something in, say, Germany. So those relatively more available for borrowing because I've added my dollars to those situations. Is that kind of what you're asking, I think? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's go back to what's the difference between appreciation and strengthening and depreciation or weakening? Very good question. Let's go back to exam review. I want to share this guy. We want to go down to when you're looking at that, you're looking at where your equilibrium point ends up. Okay, so if your equilibrium point begins, let's make this like obnoxious green. If my original exchange rate is at this green line, right? If my new exchange rate ends up above the green line, I have appreciated value of my currency. If my new appreciation or my new exchange rate ends up below that line, it's a depreciation of the currency. And all that means is its value, right? So if you think about like supply and demand for shoes or broccoli or baseball cards or whatever, if something is relatively more available, it's not as valuable, right? If something is really rare, it has more value to it. And it's just like regular supply and demand. So if I have a situation where, say, I have a bunch of Americans who are going on vacation and they want to exchange for, this is a British pounds graph, so we're apparently going to Great Britain. And so we decide to supply more American dollars to the market because then we're going to demand British pounds, right? Because we don't want those dollars anymore, do you see how our new exchange rate ends up lower than the original one? And that is depreciation of the currency. It's worth less than it was. Yes, strengthening is the same as appreciation. So like if the value of a currency goes up, it's said to be stronger, which means it has appreciated in value, which means it's just gone up in value. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. How these graphs affect loanable funds? They don't necessarily directly affect loanable funds. I would never expect you to just kind of come up with these out of nowhere. But if I am a foreign investor or if I'm dealing with foreign investors, then you'd have an issue where you have to have the right currency, and then you'd have to talk with the loanable funds market. But the question would baby step you through that. You've seen like how questions go, talk about aggregate supply and demand, now use this graph, now use that graph. It would literally say, now talk about loanable funds. In this case, you're talking about like, do people want the currency or not? Okay, I'm not going to hold on to that currency if I think it's a bad buy. If I'm somebody who's investing in currency as a way to earn money, I'm not going to hold on to a currency I think is worth less than it should be. So then I would then walk away from the market. So think about your FRQ practice from Unit 8, where you had to, I think it was it Zambia or Zimbabwe or whichever one it was. Investors are trying to leave that market. Well, the first thing that they have to do is we have to say, okay, if they don't want to be there, those investors are taking available loanable funds away, because once I uninvest, that's not going to be out there for people to use. But then I have to say, okay, well, now I'm also taking out of the currency market, right? So I also have to decrease my demand or also decrease my supply of available currency, because I don't want to hold on to that currency. So it would have to be a situation where they're like walking you through a story about this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Is that kind of what you're asking? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So the one thing that I find that kids struggle with is looking at the connection between aggregate supply demand and the Phillips curve. Okay. So I want us to take some baby steps and look at those two graphs to make sure you really understand what happens. And this is kind of a common mistake thing that I've picked up from this summer that I want to make sure we run through. Okay. So let's say I'm taking aggregate supply demand and the Phillips curve, and imagine that give you a full aggregate supply demand graph on the left and the Phillips curve on the right. Yeah. Do you see that if I took away the aggregate demand line, these are like mirror images of each other, right? You've got, both of them have a vertical long run that is the same. And then you've got kind of like, imagine there's a mirror here, right? This one goes up to the right, this one goes up to the left. So they're kind of like playing that mirror game you used to play with your friends on the playground, or if like some teacher forced you to play that for get to know you stuff. That's going to be the key in your pocket. It's going to help you walk through what happens with these graphs. Okay. If I am at equilibrium in each graph is going to be the same, right? Now, on a aggregate supply demand graph, if I am not at equilibrium but I'm at a recession, where would I be at on my aggregate demand graph? Am I on the right or the left side of the LRAS? Yeah, so a recession is kind of over here. We're going to call this like point A, right? Now, think about what is a recession. A recession, am I going to have high or low inflation? Low inflation. And what's going to happen to unemployment? It's going to be high. So let's say that I have point A over here. Do you see how those are mirror images of each other? Am I messing with your world yet? So one thing to keep in mind is you can always check your work. They should be on opposite sides of each other. Okay, if I have you draw these graphs out, remember this slide will be in your notes that I'm going to upload for you guys. If I am in a recession on my long run aggregate supply demand, it's on the left hand side of your long run aggregate supply line. If I'm in a recession on your Phillips curve, I'm on the right side of your Phillips curve. Okay, if I'm experiencing inflation, inflation is always on the right side of your long run aggregate supply, and inflation is always on the left side of your long run Phillips curve. And yes, that will work every time. These graphs are always the same. So it's basically just knowing kind of where you're at. Because if you had a question that says, this is what happens in the economy. This is, what's going on. Now shift your aggregate supply demand. I feel like a lot of you guys get caught up if I go, then show me what happens on the Phillips curve. And your brain just kind of like melts in there somewhere. And you're like, I don't understand. These are all related, right? And if you don't necessarily, like, if the graph doesn't stick in your head immediately, do what we did the first time. What is it like to be in a recession? Like if I'm in an inflationary period, inflation will be high, unemployment will be low, which pushes me up to this spot on my Phillips curve, right? So if you just can kind of talk yourself through what this should be, hopefully you can get out of your brain and make it make a little bit of sense. Okay, now on a Phillips curve question, if I am shifting aggregate demand, I'm going to move along the short run Phillips curve. Okay, and just like we did before, do you remember we had, like, if this is our green point over here, it is mirrored on the other side, right? If I have a inflationary gap over on my aggregate supply demand, my inflationary point is going to be here on the LRPC. So if I'm shifting aggregate demand, I'm going to shift along the LRPC. Okay. However, that shift only works if there's a place for you to go, right? Because if I've shifted my aggregate demand to 82 at my red dot, there's already a space on my Phillips curve that will end up being where the red dot goes on the Phillips curve. If I'm shifting aggregate supply, it gets a little bit weird. Because if I've shifted my aggregate supply line from the yellow to the red dot, right? If I've gone over here to this new line, and this is where my new equilibrium point is. Well, there's no equilibrium point on my original line for the short run Phillips curve. So what do I have to do? I need to draw a new short run Phillips curve to make sure that they are mirror images, right? Kids always go, how do I know if the SRPC moves? This is a great way to check yourself. If the question has you moving an aggregate supply line, then you're going to move the short run Phillips curve. If you're moving an aggregate demand line, you're just going to move along the short run Phillips curve. Okay. To show you what this looks like in a problem, I might say, okay, show me what happens on both graphs if you have an increase in aggregate demand. So on my aggregate supply demand graph, I would show my shift in aggregate demand, and then I would say on my Phillips curve, you're going to want to label this a little better. I would say it moves from point A to point B, and I would draw myself just like a little arrow to show what happened. Okay, and if I'm going to do this on a show me what happens when aggregate supply changes, I'm going to have my decrease in aggregate supply that I'm going to put on my graph. And then on my original Phillips curve, there's no way to mirror image that, so I need a new line because I've shifted supply. So what I want to do is I want to draw a new SRPC line, and I want to say I've shifted from SRPC1 to SRPC2. Does that make sense? Sort of. Ish. Excellent. Yeah, it's a little bit weird the first time you look at it, but once you start to kind of go, but what is the situation like if I have an inflation? What is the situation like if I have recession? And you kind of sort of talk to yourself about it, that's when hopefully these things will start to click together. The best thing you can do is practice. Go back and look at your old tests. Go back and look at your old quizzes. Take the time to look at what you got wrong the first time, and make sure that you really understand what you struggled with. Okay? So I've talked a whole lot. Wow. What is there that we can talk about that you guys have questions on that we have not talked about yet? Yeah, you're so welcome. Yeah, if you feel comfortable, feel free to log out. If you want to hang out and talk a little bit and ask me some questions, I can stay for another 15, 20 minutes. Um, for people who are listening to this on the recording version or people who came late, couple of quick reminders for you if you are either a come late or listening on the recording sort of person. As you are taking your exam, please remember a couple of things. Make sure you schedule enough time for the whole exam. Make sure you submit your graphs. If you have had issues with submitting graphs in the past, please make sure you submit them, that you upload those files as a file. Don't just copy paste them. You can email them to me if you're feeling nervous. And don't forget that this week you need to get your discussion boards done by midnight tonight if you didn't finish Unit 8. I need late work by Wednesday. And I told the kids earlier, this is my back to school week. I get kids starting tomorrow. So if you have an issue, please feel free to email or text or something like that, and be in touch. But just know that I might be in a lecture class, so I won't be able to get back to you immediately. But I will get back to you as soon as I can. Okay. Okay. So back to questions that you guys have. Let's get a blank whiteboard up here. Okay. Talk about balance of payments, like current capital credits and debits. Absolutely. So when you were talking about balance of payments, you've got the current account. I love that I found this little texting, and the capital account, right? Current account is your money, right? Capital account is your stuff. So let's say that you are a person who is an American and you buy a hotel in Canada. Okay, that transaction is going to be an interesting one where you, as an American, right, we're going to call you USA, you are now going to own more stuff but have less money because your money went to Canada, right? So our capital account would be increasing and your current account would be decreasing. And the words that we use for that are debits and credits. If you get stuck on debit and credit, think about debit and credit cards. A debit card is where you have like your money in your bank account and you're going to subtract money from that. So you're going to debit it, as in have less of it. That's your minus. A credit card would be like adding to your stuff. You'd be adding credit to yourself. You've got more money to spend. That would be your positive. So if like I buy a hotel in Canada, my money is going to Canada, but I am going to now own more capital, the hotel, that is located in Canada. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, good. If you're struggling with that one thing, there was a really great like 2-minute Mr. Clifford video. He's the ACDC econ guy. He's like the Labrador Retriever and econ teachers. He's always happy. He does a really good like 2-minute video on how current and capital are related. And I know that we stuck that into the lesson. You might grab that if you want to see another example of that. It's a pretty solid one. Okay, next question. Is the vocabulary terms in each lesson a big part of the final? Yeah, if you can't find it, let me know. I can shoot you a link to it later on. Just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send that to you. Vocabulary, yes, you need to know vocabulary. You need to know key terms. Just like you saw like on quizzes where it was pretty specific and tests where it got a little bit more general, you're going to have vocabulary. You're going to have information that you're going to be asked about that we've learned in every unit. We don't generally do a study guide for the final exam, but you're going to want to make sure that you know what stuff is. So if I asked you what a capital account is, if I ask you what a Phillips curve is, if I ask you, the components of GDP, you're going to want to know that stuff. Okay, I have a question with submitting graphs. We need to have them pre-drawn or draw them during the test. We draw them during the test. How do you submit the graph? Okay, so this is why we've been hopefully practicing with digital graphs all summer. Oh, you're welcome, Olivia. So you need to draw and submit your graphs during your final exam session. You must submit a graph to be able to submit your test. So you need to figure out what works the best for you. If you've been using Draw.io, keep doing it. That's fine. If you've been drawing things on Microsoft Word, that's fine. Just make sure everything has lines, labels, everything set on there that you want it to have. I mentioned this earlier, it may not have been logged in yet. If you are somebody who likes to hand draw graphs, by all means hand draw them. Take a picture, submit it to the test during the final exam. But tell your proctor. I would walk into the test and the first thing I would say is, hi, I'm taking an economics test. Part of this is making a graph. So either as you walk around the room, you're going to see me drawing a graph on, on PowerPoint, on Word, on Draw.io, or you're going to see me taking a picture of my graph to submit to a question. And you're going to want to be very specific about that, so that the proctor doesn't, freak out and have a moment with you. Common mistakes that people make if you have a graph that you've been working with and you just literally hit copy paste with your mouse. Sometimes those are the ones that come through with broken links. So you're going to want to actually upload the file using the picture upload box versus just copy pasting it. You're going to want to make sure that you've got the actual file uploaded. And if you're nervous about it, upload everything to the test, hit send, and then immediately send me your graphs on email the next second. Don't wait 3 days later and go, oh, hey, I made graphs, because I don't know your situation, and I don't want to have to look at you and be like, yeah, you drew those 3 days later, right? If you're nervous, send me the graphs immediately after you take your test, and I can compare your timestamp on both of those and go, hey, this is great. They were just a little nervous. I've got graphs in my email. No problem. Okay. Okay, we didn't talk about Keynesian economics and different perspectives. Would be tested on those. So Keynesian classical, you might see a Keynesian classical question in your multiple choice. I will tell you that that is not in the written portion of your test. What we do is Keynesian graphs. Those readjustment long-term sort of situations, those are pretty much only going to be in your multiple choice portion of that test if you see those questions. What shifts demand in money market graphs? So if you're in a money market situation, you're looking at people who are demanding money. It could be people who are choosing to spend more cash. It could be people who are choosing to spend cash instead of credit. It could be a business choosing to expand their horizons and maybe add on another store. It could be the government choosing to take more money and spend it. Anytime you're looking to demand cash would be a money market demand shift. Yes. So if you logged in late, there are about 58 to 60 multiple choice questions, and there are 3 multi-part written questions. So kind of balance. If you suck at one, you can kind of balance it out with the written questions. The written questions are more likely to have you draw a graph than not. They're not going to be the ones where they're just like, hey, what's the difference between X and Y? For your final, those written questions are going to be like, the economy is in a recession, draw that. Now, how would the Federal Reserve fix it? Now, how does that affect the loanable funds market or whatever? They're going to be those multiple portion questions that ask you to kind of link together concepts. Questions, hello, for both tests. So yeah, what we ended up doing, because so many of you guys were confused about that, we just combined them all together. So you'll have one test to take in one setting with your multiple choice and your written all in the same thing. because it was too confusing for kids to try and schedule like multiple sessions or whatever. They're all together, and you may see the written questions mixed in with your multiple choice. Doesn't matter what order you answer them in, just make sure you answer them. Yeah, it just got confusing. I was like, hey, can we just fix this in the background so that kids can just function as humans? And they were okay with it. So yes, ma'am, you have a good night too. So they major on the test you didn't go over. I went through the big graphs and stuff that we've studied this summer. So you've at least got on all the big graphs. But you're going to want to go back and look at vocabulary and things that we've studied. Like I said, it might be helpful to look at old tests and quizzes so that you go back and you look at a question and go, oh man, I remember having to look that one up, or whatever it is. So I did not go over every single thing on the test, but I went through the big stuff that you generally are going to stumble over. But you're going to want to look back at vocabulary and little things that don't involve graphs and that sort of stuff. When notes are recorded, we set out. It generally takes this recording, once I push stop, sometimes takes like an hour to process. It's all background thinking through different databases. I will post it as soon as it does finish recording. So, it will be out tonight, definitely. Will it be out in the next 10 minutes? No. It generally will take about an hour, hour and a half for all of that to process. Maddie, if we still have attempts left on old quizzes, sure, why not? Corbin, will there be any repeat questions from our quizzes? There might be. You might see a complete new set of questions. You might see some questions that you had in the past. It is totally, like I said, randomly pulled from a database. So each test should be individual and unique, but fair. Is there anything we don't need to know or study for the test? I don't think I can necessarily say that. Don't study your Mandarin Chinese alphabet. That would be not helpful. I would have a good general knowledge of the stuff that we've talked about over the course of the summer. And if you run into something, I'm sorry, just reading the next question. If you run into something that you don't know, like I said, shoot me an email or something during the week. I am back to school this week, so I'm a little busier. I've got meetings, I've got face-to-face classes, but I'll do my best to get back to you ASAP. How many questions can you miss to still pass the test? I didn't major in math on purpose, but you generally want to make sure that you are passing more questions than you are not. Monetary and fiscal. Yes, ma'am. Let's see, let's erase this. What is your question about that? Just kind of what the difference is, or what are you looking for in that guy? What's the difference? Okay, so fiscal policy. We're going to put monetary policy over here. And then we're going to draw ourselves a couple little things like this. So, we're going to label this guy inflation. We're going to label this guy recession. Okay. So you have fiscal policy, monetary policy, always. Monetary policy is the Fed. Okay. Fiscal policy is Congress. Okay. You're going to want to make yourself some notes about these two things. I want to say fiscal was unit 5, 5, and 7, I think, and monetary policy was unit 6, if I remember right. So when you have inflation and recession, Congress and the Federal Reserve are going to respond to them differently. Okay, Congress has the power to, let's get a different color in here. They can do something with taxes, and they can change government spending. Okay, and they can fix here, they can do taxes, and they can do government spending. Those are the only two things that fiscal policy can do, is mess with taxes and mess with government spending, right? So if you think about like us being in an inflationary period, my economy is running really, really hot, and I want to somehow slow it down. What do I want to do with taxes? Do I want to raise or lower them? Yeah, good. I want to raise taxes, right? I want to say, hey, if I raise taxes, people have less money. And if they spend less money, then my economy slows down, right? And on the other side, I want to, in a recession, I'm going to want to lower taxes. I want to make sure that people have more money to spend so they can go out and spend it and hopefully kickstart my economy, right? On government spending, if I'm in an inflationary period, do I want the government to spend more money? No, right? I want the government to spend less money to calm down some of that aggregate demand. And if I'm in a recession, I want the government to spend more money to hopefully kickstart what's happening in my economy. Got it? Okay. So then for, let's choose a different color, for the Federal Reserve, if I'm looking at the Fed for monetary policy, they can change the required reserve ratio. They can change, what order do I want to do these in? We can do required reserve ratio, we can do interest rates. And they can change open market operations. I'm so glad I figured out how to type on the screen so you guys could actually read it. So, in this case, that's market, not marquee. Sorry. The Federal Reserve has 3 things that they can do as far as monetary policy. I can change the required reserve ratio, which is when I deposit money in the bank, what percentage of it is the bank required to keep in reserve, and how much can they lend out? Okay, so if I'm going to mess around with the required reserve ratio, this is something the Fed has basically never done. They haven't messed with it in like 100 years. But if they wanted to, if you want a inflationary period to calm down, you want to restrict the amount of money in circulation. So you want to make sure that banks are holding on to more money. So you would increase the required reserve ratio. You'd say instead of holding on to 10% of your money, banks now have to hold on to 25% of your money. So they have less money to loan out, which means people and businesses get less loans, which means they spend less money, which is going to pull us back from an inflationary period. In a recessionary period, you're going to decrease the required reserve. You're going to say, hey, you don't have to hold on to as much cash. loan it out to people, encourage them to spend it because we want the market to kind of kickstart itself. Okay. We reduced this down a little bit in this class, but interest rates are the same sort of thing. Interest rates is the price of money. So the Fed is going to do things that are going to increase interest rates to make it harder for you to borrow money in inflation, and they're going to decrease interest rates to make it easier for you to borrow money in a recession. Okay, and then for open market operations, that's the buying and selling of government bonds. So just like we talked about before, if my market is running really, really, really hot, do I want to buy or sell government bonds? Do you guys remember? Yeah, you want to sell bonds so that you can make a smaller economy. And in a recession, you want to buy bonds to make a bigger economy. Common mistakes that kids make. This is my favorite one to grade because it frustrates me every single time. When a question says something like, what are the what are the government's two choices to change to fix this inflationary problem? And you tell me that they can either take a expansionary or a contractionary approach. That's like saying, what's 2 plus 2? Yes. You're giving me all the options, right? If they ask you, what are the Fed's 3 choices to fix this problem? I need to see you tell me, like if it's inflationary, I need to see increase required reserve ratio, increase interest rates, sell bonds, right? If you simply tell me they should take an expansionary or contractionary approach, that's not the answer. You're giving me all the answers at that point, right? What color is your car? Yes. Not very helpful, right? So you want to be specific on what should they do with taxes, what should they do with government spending, what should they do with interest rates, etc., to make sure you're answering the question that's being asked to you. Okay. Any other questions for me? Yeah, you're really welcome. No, they're not the same thing, right? So Congress is the House and the Senate. They're the ones that pass government policies like taxes and spending. The Federal Reserve are the ones who make policies about our money. So the Federal Reserve are the ones who are controlling how much money is in circulation, what interest rates look like. They're looking to be the ones who balance money across the whole economy. So they're going to be the ones making decisions about money, hence monetary policy. Yeah, absolutely. Any final questions from you guys? Okay, so if you feel comfortable, go ahead and log out. I'm going to stop recording so this thing can start processing. My guess is that by about 7 o'clock or so, I should be able to post you guys a recording and the slides and stuff that we talked through, so you have those to study with. Good luck this week. I hope you guys completely rock this test and do a really good job.